Oh, here we go. Oh no, 21st, 28th, 5th. Can't quite see it up there yet. Simon. Let me refresh on it. Oh, here we go. Yep, says it's live. Okay. Yeah. Alrighty. So I think we're good to go. It is working, says our fantastic producer, Simon. Okay, I'm going to do a countdown and then we should go straight into it. And let me just turn it off. Let me just... Okay. For Hoon for the 12th of May. There we go. All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Tēnā koutou katoa and welcome to the Hoon. I am Bernard Hickey, and from the very hot place of Spain, we have co-host Peter Bale. Peter, it's great to see you.
Good morning, Bernard. I mean, good afternoon to you, but I've just got up, got my coffee, haven't got the gin and tonic again. And as you pointed out, I've got possibly the best shirt we've had so far on the show.
I think this is right up there in the top 10 shirts category.
I would say it's either crayfish or langoustine.
But because it's from Europe, it can't be lobster, so it's more langoustine.
That's right. I think I think it might actually be a crayfish, or what we think of in New Zealand as a crayfish, and everybody else are called lobsters, except of course we know lobsters have the pincers. But I think we need a deep analysis of the lobster versus crayfish.
So have you managed to do a deep analysis with one on your plate yet? Because the
yes,
seafood around where you were is very good.
That's true. Funnily enough, in Tangier the other day in Morocco, where I popped across just to get some carpet, as it were, literally 2 of them, in fact. I had grilled langoustine from a sort of street market, and it was bloody delicious. It was probably the best meal I had over there. It was literally in the street. It was lovely. Well, not, it was on a plate.
Grilled, so it had some sort of, spicy things.
It did have some spicy things in it, but it was basically just delicious, fresh seafood from the Atlantic/Mediterranean, from the Straits of Gibraltar, more or less, or the estrecho, as they call it here.
The estrecho.
Not the Straits of, they try not estrecho. They try not to mention Gibraltar too often. Which, of course, as we know, it is actually Jebel Al Tariq, which is the mountain of Tariq. So it's actually an Arabic name anglicized into Gibraltar. Anyway, that's our travel log for today.
Yeah, well, and tell us about the weather. Got to talk about the weather, because the weather is the thing we are all talking about all the time, forever. And I hear there's been new records in Spain.
Well, it's been the driest April on record, and Spain just yesterday announced several $1 billion in emergency aid to farmers. They've also said that rubbish workers and street vendors and people do not have to work if the Met Office here warns of high temperatures, because that follows the death of a delivery person and a street sweeper in high temperatures. And it is quite remarkable. I mean, it was 29 degrees here yesterday, which is 4 degrees above the average. Although I did notice that it was more than 30 this time last year. So it's not necessarily. I mean, April has been incredibly dry. I've also noticed where I am, there's an amazing filled-in lake that Franco filled in 1953 to destroy one of the best wetlands in Europe, one of the biggest wetlands in Europe, and it's being allowed to recover. But a paella rice farm, has been converted into normal agriculture because there's not enough water to sustain it.
Oh, wow. So
yeah, it's
this
really,
special type of rice for paella?
Absolutely, yeah. It's like arborio rice, but you wouldn't use arborio rice for a paella. You only use genuine, authentic paella rice for a paella from Spain.
Wow. So that's,
I'm sure we have that in
another
New Zealand.
sign that the weather is weird all over the place. And right now, you'll be happy to know that for the last 2 weeks in Auckland, we have had inundations, and it got down to 8 or 9 degrees here last night. We had a southerly switch as well. And another one of these, it wasn't quite as bad as the Auckland anniversary weekend event, but there were plenty of people flooded out, and yet again, concerns about what's going to happen with
And the robustness of infrastructure again, Bernard. I mean, again, looked as though drains weren't necessarily working properly. But when you say, watching it from here, I was alarmed, having had my neighbour's, cliff fall into the sea, rather alarmingly, back during just in hail rather than Gabrielle. The warning to people who've had cliff top damage already that it was going to get worse. And also, I see our old friend Michael Field was posting a global weather survey that shows another one hitting next week, coming down the west coast, which will not be very good news for people in Piha and places like that are still not recovered on the west coast, let alone Northland. So, what's that for this year so far?
Oh, it's just awful. And whenever we look at a map of New Zealand, it seems to have a big swathe of blue with splashes of red coming down from the Central Pacific, all that hot water up there turning into moisture, and then doing the whole atmospheric river coming on down, and it's still coming. It's coming since the end of January.
Well, Bernard,
we're well into May.
Yeah, but Bernard, I think we without turning correlation into causality, we do know that this shit started when you arrived in Auckland.
Yeah, it's my fault. That's true.
Well, there's a definite correlation there, but we
did move from Wellington to Auckland for the weather, and then it has basically rained for 3.5 months. But it is really the thing that everyone.
How are things going in New Zealand? I wrote a piece for North and South, the next issue. It hasn't been published yet. Yesterday, about whether foreign policy under Hipkins had shifted. And it seems to me it has slightly, sort of almost imperceptibly, but he hasn't been invited to China in the same way that Jacinda Ardern was, or he hasn't prioritised that trip. And he's of course told Nanaia Mahuta he wants to see her, quotes, out and about, whatever that means. But he is managing to go to Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, well, that's the news this week, I suppose, that he's been invited by Joe Biden and the other members of the Quad to Papua New Guinea, where it seems America is going to sign a defense pact with Papua New Guinea, which has surprised a few people, because up until the last year or so, Papua New Guinea has been flirting with China. And one of the great signs from one of the last APECs was this extraordinary motorway that had been built by the Chinese. And
that's
it looks like
for the Maseratis. That's for the Maserati.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so that's a big deal. And whenever Joe Biden comes to our neck of the woods, that's interesting. Chris Hipkins going to meet him at what is effectively a Quad type meeting, one of these defense type meetings, isn't going to be welcomed by China. And certainly, you're right, I think he has a slightly tougher line on China than maybe Jacinda Ardern, although I had noticed in the last year or so, Ardern's tone on China had toughened up.
Yes, the more assertive thing about China. Yes, that's true.
Yeah, and we've got to know that there are lots of things happening that we don't know about. In particular, briefings from GCSB and SIS to the Prime Minister, who is right at the heart of that. Now, Chris Hipkins was, one of the 3 or 4 people running the government anyway, so he would have had those briefings as well. And it is quite noticeable, the difference in tone between the Labour government and, of course, the National Opposition, who are still very positive about building relations with China and have been connected to China in various ways, in particular trips and, of course, the significant numbers of individuals and organisations connected to the United Front, the Chinese government-driven foreign influence program, and that, I think, may be one of the things that blows up in the election campaign if the government wants to push it hard, because National is the one that's out of line with
what does Jerry
parties.
Brownlee actually think? Does he think anything? I mean, I was really struck. In fact, I think I put him in the second to last paragraph, because he sort of pipes up, says various kind of John Key-ish things about the need to be closer to China, and even really stupid things about Xinjiang from time to time. What is Jerry Brownley's foreign policy? And would he actually be foreign minister, or are we going to see David Seymour going in there because he's so incredibly experienced on international matters?
Yeah, no, I think Seymour wants to stay at home and have a good old crack at economic policy. And he's, I suspect, hoping that if he gets a very, very high share of the vote, he might get some sort of associate finance minister role and somewhere in cabinet. Because the real game, as we saw when ACT were with National in 2008 to 2011, Rodney Hyde got very involved in creating the super city and, really did a lot of things. Now, in the end, he flamed out. But I think David Seymour wants to stay at home and do that. Jerry Brownlee, I think you're right. He's currently the Foreign Affairs spokesperson, but he has put his foot in it a few times, and he definitely would not be appreciated by our Five Eyes partners. He is seen as a bit too friendly to China. And I think there would be a few others, Todd McClay, perhaps, who'd maybe have a look at that role if Jerry didn't get it. And I think it all depends too on the strength of Christopher Luxon post-election. If it's a very clear win, if they do win, then he has the power to be a bit more assertive. And there is always a chance that he does it himself. It's been a while since we've had a Prime Minister doubling up as a foreign minister, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's where Christopher Luxon finds himself. He's talked in the last couple of weeks.
Remember, Bernard, you might remember I wrote a piece, I'm sure you read every word of it for North and South about this actually, when the new history of the New Zealand Foreign Ministry came out. I find it hard to call it MFAT, which just sounds like something you take to lose some weight, but people inside the foreign ministry were very admiring, and probably the only people who were actually, of Winston Peters, because he actually got substantial increases in the foreign affairs budget. But people just also remember Norman Kirk, as a very effective prime minister and supporter of it. I think that one of the things, Bernard, and I'd love to explore this sometime, is New Zealand's multilateral role, because it's our old friend Robert Patman often talks about the potential of New Zealand to be stronger in a multilateral world, combining with other smaller countries. And Jacinda Ardern did seem to be very committed to that, and I don't see any signal that Chris Hipkins is committed to that.
Not as much. I mean, he's got his hands full with various crises here. I think Christopher Luxon, if he does take something up like that, would be interested in going overseas a lot. He said a few weeks ago that one of his key things, if they do win, is basically to send a whole bunch of ministers out on exploration missions to promote New Zealand's exports. He talked a lot about hustle. There's going to be a lot of hustling going on. We're going out there
dressing up as kiwi fruit and the like.
Yeah, that's right.
Actually, Jerry Brownlee would look very good in a kiwi fruit suit, I think.
Yeah. Or maybe, maybe someone from Te Pāti Māori could become the foreign minister.
Tell us, what's that all about? I mean, we talked last week, Bernard, about whether Te Pāti Māori was, in a sense, replacing the strength of the Māori caucus inside Labour. So what's Christopher Luxon up to with the Te Pāti Māori?
Yeah, this was a very strong comment. He had a full-on, press conference, press release coming out and saying, we've decided that we're ruling out forming any sort of governing arrangement with Te Pāti Māori. And there was no great demand for it. Most people who've been following MMP for 20 or 30 years or so take the view that it's expected that there's going to be some sort of negotiation after an election. It's only the last term, this current term, which has seen one party able to govern on its own. No one expects that Labour or National would be able to govern alone again. The polls are certainly saying that Te Pāti Māori have the ability to choose who's the government. And I think it surprised a few people that he'd come out so strongly and said, we want nothing to do with Te Pāti Māori, which he argued was because they're a quite different party to when National partnered with Te Pāti Māori for 3 terms. And it's true, they've got different leadership, and they had...
Is it that they're more radical from his point of view, Bernard? Or is this actually also an appeal to some of the darker sides of sentiment that live inside National? Or National voters?
I think it's unfortunate, the strong view he's taken. He's been accused of dog whistling on this issue of, iwi Kiwi co-governance, which it was very interesting to hear Ben Thomas, the centre-righty political commentator who's on the spin-off, point out that the last time that National took this very sceptical view about co-governance, about iwi having more votes than other people, somehow this wasn't democratic, that iwi were having more power than they should. That was Don Brash, and his Arewa speech
and
was
that went well.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's one of the risks for Christopher Luxon, is that in coming down so strongly against Te Pāti Māori, talking about one man, one vote. He risks painting himself as an extremist, as someone who isn't nimble. And one of the reasons he was voted in by his caucus is that they saw him as John Key version 2.0. And Key was much nimbler on his feet in dealing with these sorts of issues. He didn't rule people in or out. It was only at the end in 2011 and 14 from memory that he ruled out Winston Peters. And even then, Bill English didn't rule him out. And he was able to work with people. John Key also tacked the party to the centre before they got back into power in 2008. And that's not the impression I get from Christopher Luxon. If anything, he's dragging the party of the centre to the right. Now, you do that when you're in trouble and you need to shore up your base and make sure you don't get walloped by a party even further on the right. But he doesn't need to do that. I mean, ACT have got that. There's a good 10, 11 percentage points with ACT. He needs to be foraging around in the middle to win an election, which is clearly close. We've got 2 more polls this week. One from Curia, which is the David Farrar poll, which even though he's obviously connected to the National Party, there's no suggestion that the poll itself is a problem. And we've also heard from Talbot Mills, which is the Labour Party pollster, its corporate poll, showing that it is neck and neck. It really is centre-right versus centre-left, Green Labour versus National ACT. They're both on about 30, 33, 34 for National Labour, 10 each for Greens and ACT. And those 4 or 5 seats that Te Pāti Māori are very expected to get will be to the decider. Now, there is the remote prospect that the Opportunities Party gets in. But I must say, this was the week when we learned that Christopher Luxon, I think, is not quite as nimble and able to sway with the breeze in the way that John Key was.
Well, speaking of swaying with the breeze, do you think Winston Peters needs to do a waka jump to Pāti Māori? It would be entertaining.
That would be if that happens. I will be breaking out the popcorn because that will be entertaining.
Bernard, one question on those polls: do polls show, or do they ever ask this question about people's attitudes to Māoridom and the rise of Māoridom and the actually the implementation of the UN agreements on Indigenous people, which to some extent Chris Hipkins is backtracking from?
Yeah, I am not sure from the polling and the focus grouping how effective it is. I suspect it's very situational. And also the people who are saying these sorts of things, the groundswellers, if you like, they're not in the middle. And if you know that in an MMP election, the way you win is to win the median voters. And one of the things you've got to be wary of if you're an opposition party is being painted as too changey, too extremist. And I think that's where Chris Hipkins is going to go in this election campaign. You've already seen it this week. Speeches from Grant Robertson saying that National have to say what they'd cut, which budget are they going to slash to give us the tax cuts and all these other things. So I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, interesting. I just note, Bernard, that Brett Tamahori, our old friend on the pod, and a couple of other people are pointing out that that this really is a dog whistle, and it's kind of going off, and the dogs, as usual with dog whistles, only the dogs can hear it, but they know it when they hear it. Speaking of focus groups, there's fabulous Professor Robert Patman.
Ah, yes.
we
Well,
could-
we've
we
got our
could-
own focus group of 3 here, haven't we? It's
Exactly,
very good.
exactly. And he's already. I can see he's got gin in that plastic bottle of his is there, and he's off to the races.
Yeah, well,
Good.
As it
can't
were.
beat a gin and tonic, can you?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Cheers to you, Robert. Great to see
Cheers.
you.
Yeah.
Good to see you guys.
I'm on the coffee, Robert. How are you? So Victory
fine.
Day this week in Russia was a little bit muted. and
Sorry,
we
I
had
didn't quite catch that.
I said Victory Day was a little bit muted.
Yes, you could say that with one tank being present and
Yeah, one World War II tank and
yeah,
no
it's about
Iskander
80 years
missiles,
of
'cause
age,
they're-
wasn't it?
Exactly. Yes. So what do you make of it all? And the thing I found so extraordinary with it was Putin's ability. I mean, we all know that he's cynicism is his defining characteristic. This ability to yet again equate war with Ukraine as a war with Nazis. I thought
Yes,
that was flabbergasting.
it's the victimhood that many so-called populist leaders pursue. Although I hesitate to call Putin a populist leader because he's an authoritarian leader. But it was extraordinary, and the fact that he cannot seem to absorb the point that the world is not against him because Russia is Russia, but because Russia has invaded neighbouring Ukraine. It's a fundamental breach of international law. But there was an interesting development this week, and something of a game changer. The British have done something which the Americans have declined to do, which is to provide what's called Shadow Storm cruise missiles. They provided these cruise missiles which have a stealth capability. That is, they fly at treetop level, and they cannot be easily detected by radar. Now they have given the Ukraine they've already transferred them apparently, and they're still transferring them. But this will give the Ukrainian counteroffensive, when it looms, or even before the counteroffensive, a capability to hit the Russians anywhere in occupied Ukraine, something they haven't had before. And of course, I think Crimea in particular will be in the crosshairs. It's an interesting development, and the British do not seem to be, because they're in a qualitatively different position to the Americans, in the sense that if the American made this sort of move, it might be seen as more provocative than if the Brits do it. But it's an interesting development.
It's really good. It's really going to be interesting to see if they launch it during the Eurovision Song Contest.
Maybe that's the secret signal. The Ukrainian singers will be up there right now. It's time to go.
Well, the Eurovision organisers have
at
said
the moment,
that
a lot of
Zelensky can't
commentators
speak.
in the last
Sorry.
24 hours, and you guys must have noticed this, claim the counteroffensive has already begun. So watch this space. Apparently, there's some very alarmed Russian military journalists reporting about declining Russian position around Bakhmut. So yeah, I mean it's a very interesting situation.
And I saw also that the Wagner guy, Grigory
Prigozhin.
Prigozhin, came out with this weird sort of statement saying, "I'm out of here unless you give me the ammunition. You know, you guys are hopeless." I mean, I couldn't understand the Russian, of course, but he looked very serious about it.
Oh, it was full of expletives. He also, one of the videos he recorded had, unfortunately, a series of dead Wagner troops in the background.
Ooh, yeah.
He was furious, and he singled out several of Putin's, the defense minister Shoigu in particular, but another senior official as well. And it's quite clear that Prigozhin believes he's got some leverage on the Putin regime. So far, or until recently, he seemed to be operating with Putin's blessing. I'm just wondering now whether Prigozhin is actually sensing blood, in terms of he's now in a position to actually present himself as an alternative to Putin. He actually described Putin as happy grandfather, which was
it's unclear. It's unclear whether he was referring to Putin, but it was close enough. And also,
many Russians took it to be quite rude.
Exactly, and as a complete asshole, which is, and I think is absolutely correct.
He's getting bolder and bolder. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And sorry, no, there's a Medusa story from the excellent Medusa website, which is operating from the Baltics because it can't operate inside Russia anymore. That the Kremlin is looking to rein in Prigozhin, so he might be wise not to go near too many high windows.
Yeah, it's the sliding doors and the open windows you've got to be careful about.
And the tea.
And Robert.
The tea,
Yeah,
that's
and Robert,
right.
Robert, not to
Come
end
for
your
a cup of
underpants-
tea
and-
with me on the 15th floor.
Yeah, and the Novichok in your underpants.
They get you one way or the other that way. It's either the tea or the window.
Or the underpants. I think the only way you've got to be careful with your underpants. So I go completely commando now to avoid anybody putting Novichok in my underpants. But Robert, when not to turn you too much into an armchair general, although I think what Bernard and I need is a small sandpit with various toy tanks and things on them to represent the forces. But would you imagine, based on your reading of people like of the various defence analysts, that the likelihood of a Ukrainian counter-offensive is to try to cut off, to get that spit that extends out towards Crimea, to kind of cut off Crimea and cut off Russian troops with it?
There's also unconfirmed reports that Ukrainian troops are moving in large numbers towards Belgorod on the Ukrainian border with Russia, which suggests they may be sweeping around behind the Russian position and may perhaps to encircle them. But it's all speculation at the moment. We don't know how, these are unconfirmed reports. I agree with you, though, Peter. I personally think in some shape or form, Crimea is going to be targeted in this counter-offensive.
Yeah, I think if they're going to Belgorod or around that way and cross into actual Russian territory, then we're in a whole other game.
Oh, I don't think they're going to do that. I think it's more to try to cut the Russian withdrawal lines of easy withdrawal for Russian troops. The other thing we have to go to, quite frankly, if they lose Crimea, if Russia loses Crimea, I think Putin is basically toast. I mean, I don't think he can survive that at all.
Now, I'm just jumping back across the Atlantic, Robert. In the last week or so, there's been quite an interesting speech by the US Secretary of State, in which he has given a quite different view of how the world should be, with America, and in particular the American sphere, different from what we would have come to know as the Washington Consensus. So for a good 30 years post-Cold War, the idea was that we'd have an opening up of trade, that globalization, free markets would lift everyone's tide, and everyone's boats would rise, and eventually everyone would become good, friendly Democrats and democratic. And even up until 5 or 6 years ago, with Obama, President Obama, that was still pretty much in force. Now that we've got this clash between the United States and China with what's happened in Ukraine, America seems a bit more focused on thinking a lot more about its competition with China, but B, using what they call industrial policy, effectively providing subsidies for its local firms, particularly at the moment around the green industrial revolution, moving towards renewable energy, also investing in their own chip makers, these sorts of things. What did you make about this debate, which essentially said the Washington, the king is dead. Consensus is dead. The Washington Consensus is dead. Now it's new green industrial policy. What did you make of this big shift?
It's an interesting development, and Jake Sullivan, I think, is the person, rather than the Secretary of State, who made the announcement at Brookings, I think, the Brookings Institution. And there's definitely a shift going on, which began in the second year of the Biden administration with the passing of two important pieces of legislation: the CHIPS legislation, which provides about $52 billion in terms of subsidies to help American companies develop semiconductors. That's a huge subsidy, which apparently many companies have taken up. And in addition, there's the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides tax credits for companies which are going in the direction of clean energy. And that also apparently is being taken up to a much greater degree than the administration anticipated. So they're two interesting developments. I think you're right. I think that Biden has shown that he's something more of an economic nationalist than some of the previous presidents, with the exception, of course, of Donald Trump. It's an interesting development, and I think the Americans could be disappointed, however, because they've done very well out of globalization. If you look at the most recent data, out of the top the five, if you look at the top 50 and largest, the most largest company, the largest 50 companies in the world, I'll get there in a minute. 32 of them are America, and they've done very nicely, thank you, out of globalization. And the other thing here is I'm not sure globalization can be controlled by the United States. I understand America wanted to get more control of their economy, but that actually is quite bad news if America is sort of trying to sort of dictate a new form of industrial economics on a global basis, and is sort of trying to decouple from China. I'm not sure that's possible. Jake Sullivan denied that when he was questioned, was the United States decoupling? He said, no, we describe this new strategy as de-risking. But it's a bit worrying because we were hoping, I mean, countries like New Zealand were hoping that the Biden administration might take America into the Comprehensive and Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also it would start providing much needed support for the WTO, which was under siege from the Trump administration. And I think that what these developments have signaled is that the United States is going to continue to be an outlier. I mean, let's be quite clear about this. These moves smack of American exceptionism.
Absolutely.
America
And then,
has
of
not
course,
joined the
Robert,
International Criminal Court. It it has all the privileges of being a veto wielding member of the Security Council. I think it could be in for a bit of a shock because, in the sense that I don't think you can no more deglobalize than you can deindustrialize. And I think myself that America seems to be assuming here it can call the shots economically by having a much more national emphasis, and everyone else has to go along with it. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with America making itself less vulnerable, but I think it's going to continue to need the rest of the world. You only have to look at the top performing American companies. They are very closely interwoven with the global market economy, and I don't think there's going to be too much decoupling.
Well, I think, Robert, we're also going to see very quickly this become a gigantic domestic issue in the United States as soon as next week with the spending limit, the debate over the spending limit. And of course, we had our old friend Donald Trump this week make an intervention suggesting that default was the better option than increasing the spending limit. And one of the things that is pushing the government spending limit is this overtake up of the IRD, the Inflation Reduction Act.
But that's very rich coming from Mr. Trump, isn't it? Because after all, the American debt dramatically increased under his watch. And,
because he cut taxes for companies.
Yeah, I mean, that's extraordinary hypocrisy on his part. By the way, that was totally a sensational appearance on CNN, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, it was. I mean, but I loved his line about he was challenged as to why he hadn't done this when he was president. He said, "Well, I'm not president anymore."
Yes,
it's just, as you say, hypocrisy.
Well, yes, but I mean, I was just struck by the number of how should I put it? He was economical with the truth from the beginning to the end in that interview, and it's just as well it wasn't recorded, because I think it wouldn't be a question of fact checking, but it would have been actually trying to identify any facts at all. I mean, it was extraordinary.
Excuse me, Robert, I do the jokes here, right?
Yeah, 72-minute exercise in rhetoric.
And it gave him a platform, unfortunately, to say things like, and it must be destabilizing, given that he has a higher approval rating than Biden right now, shockingly. And he was saying things like, well, I'd get in and stop this war in Ukraine immediately. I'm not going to support the Ukrainians.
Oh, yes, that was, that had overtones of his pledge in 2016 on the campaign trail that if he elected president, he would defeat ISIS within 24 hours. When he was challenged about that by a Los Angeles Times journalist, he responded that he would love to divulge information, but that would alert the enemy, which I thought was a nice touch at the time. But this is pretend politics. This is not serious. He
could be seriously the president within a couple of years.
He could be, and that's probably, we discussed AUKUS recently. New Zealand needs to think very hard whether it wants to be part of an enhanced security arrangement in which Mr. Trump may be leader of, along with the UK and Australia, or perhaps Mr. DeSantis, because I think Mr. Trump's got some more legal problems looming, and I'm not convinced he's going to make it. I mean, it's one thing to be on a CNN town hall where much of the audience seemed to be predisposed to believe everything he said. But it's quite another thing. I think there'll be many Americans that are appalled by some of his claims, particularly his claim that he may well grant pardons to many of the people involved in the insurrection against the democratic outcome of the 2020 election, in which 8 Americans died. This is extraordinary, and I think while there may be 40% of Americans, happy to back him, I still think there'll be a majority who may feel very uneasy about Mr. Trump making it to the White House again.
Here's hoping you're right, Robert. Thank you very much for coming on the show
Thank
again.
you.
Lovely to see you.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank
Great
you.
to see you.
And
Thank you.
we'll see what happens the next week in Ukraine. I'd like to welcome onto the show Diana Crossan, who was the retirement commissioner for some time and was one of the people, about 90 or so, who signed a letter this week saying that New Zealand needs some sort of wealth tax. Welcome on to the Hoon, Diana. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Bernard, but we didn't actually say that. What we said was we think that those of us who are financially comfortable could pay more tax. And the
So you didn't necessarily say a wealth tax?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, we talked about the fact that...
How do we define financial comfort if not by the word wealth, Diana?
No, we're not talking about a wealth tax. We're talking about all kinds of taxes.
Oh, right.
Just a
Oh,
wealth.
I see. Mm-hmm.
No, we were saying that your income tax, for example, could go up at the top end, and that we were carefully not stating which kind of tax, but saying that those of us who are financially comfortable are willing to pay more tax, and think that New Zealand needs to have a bigger tax take. We come lower than the average OECD of the countries. We want the services of France and Scandinavia and other countries who pay more tax at the top end. We don't want to, we weren't suggesting that everybody pay more tax. We were saying that we were in a position to pay more tax. And
but what is the level, Diana, of what is the appropriate level of?
Well, 39% is the top range at the moment. But the issue, if you look internationally, excuse me, New Zealand pays something like 32%, collects 32% of GDP through the tax take. In Germany, it's 38%. In Netherlands, it's 40%. We collect 113 billion. And if we were to go to similar to Germany and Netherlands, we would have another 20 billion-ish. This is all.
But Diana, one of the interesting things about our is that we have quite a high consumption tax, which is very broadly applied. And when you look at our income, they're not violently different to what other people pay. But the difference between us and these other OECD countries have high levels of tax, better public services, more productivity, is that they do have some form of tax on increases in, also have taxes on estate taxes, which we don't have.
Yeah.
New Zealand increased the share of the economy, if you like, that is taxed without doing some sort of wealth tax.
Well, it would. I think all I was saying was the letter didn't say that. That was all, because we were careful in saying that because the people that signed it to say that they could pay more tax, and they weren't necessarily saying how that would be. So I'm not a tax expert, as you know. So I was happy to sign it, and I'm happy to talk about the need, the inequality, the inequity, I suppose I should say, and the, we want clean rivers, we want a health system where the waiting lists for those who can't afford to pay health insurance is so long, and we want equitable education. We know all the things we want. I'm involved in several charities, and we're always struggling to get people to help us, support us, and it's fundamentally wish the government would be funding that. So we didn't go into the detail of which of the tax possibilities there were. We know that you can't compare across the board, because Australia, they don't start taxing people till a certain level, and we tax from day one. So there's all kinds of ways it could be cut to make it fairer, to make it and to bring in more dollars.
Yeah, Diana.
So
we
one of the
were talking about this last week or 2 weeks ago when I was in Oslo, because naturally you arrive in the country and 20 minutes later you're an expert. But the tax, the minimum tax rate there is 22%, and then it goes up quite steeply as far as income goes. But it just seems, this whole thing with New Zealand not having a tax-free threshold does make it a bit of an outlier. And I wonder where you think economic growth stands in here, because it seems to me that New Zealand has a kind of there's a strong anti-growth mindset in New Zealand as well. That we want these public services, but do we want actual economic growth as well, which also supports those services?
Yes, that's a tricky one, and that's what some of the people who've responded to the letter talked about. And of course, this isn't in isolation. You don't just raise the taxes in isolation. So what policy that would involve look at issues like where unintended consequences of raising this tax means there'd be less productivity. I mean, it's a complex area. What we were saying was, and what we've been surprised about is that people have been ringing in to put their name to it. We've had, we had just under 100 on the day, and now we've had in the first few hours 30 people ringing in and saying, how do I sign up? So we're concerned. New Zealanders are concerned about the lack of the services that we have, and most of them aren't tax experts. So they're saying, would somebody please get on with this and look at all the complexities and know that it's not just about cutting taxes.
Just finally, Diana, one of the pushbacks from others in response to the letter was, that's fine. These people want to pay more tax. They should voluntarily do it. What did you think of that?
Oh, well, yeah, I agreed with some of the other responders who said, one of the people who was far wealthier than me said, I do put my hand in my pocket. I do have a philanthropic foundation, but I want a fair system. And just because relying on me to put my hand in my pocket to make the local ambulance work, for example, is crazy, and it's unfair. And we'll always need philanthropists. We'll always need lots of volunteers in New Zealand to make things work. We know that. But let's have a fairer tax system to make it work too.
Diana Crossan. Diana, thank you very much for coming on to the Hoon. Lovely to see you and see you again.
Thank you so much, Diana.
And we'd love to have you on again at some point talking about these and other issues. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Well,
and
another
we do in
person...
fact have a tax expert.
Oh yeah, no, we've got a combo here. We've got Terry Boucher on the show this evening. Terry, lovely to see you.
Well,
welcome to the Hoon.
Wait a second, Bernard. I need to make a declaration. Is that I rang Terry when I first came back to New Zealand I haven't engaged with him on this, but I rang him to ask his advice about how I could protect as much of my enormous global wealth as possible.
You haven't signed the letter, Peter.
I haven't signed the letter, and I don't intend to. But yeah, I would be keener on finding out a little bit of a lower tax environment in a sense. But Terry, go ahead.
Yeah,
well,
no, Terry, lovely.
I was going to say Morena. Kia ora, everyone. Thank you for inviting me along.
Terry.
And actually, Peter has just touched on something which lies behind one of the reasons I signed that letter. And that is talking about the well-known principle of broad base, low rate. That is something that has been fundamental to the New Zealand tax system. And coincidentally, it is 30 years ago next week that I arrived in New Zealand. So, and it's quite interesting to look back on that with that. But that was weirdly, even though I'd already been working in tax for nearly 10 years, it was only when I got to New Zealand that the sort of the concept of broad-based low rate was being espoused, and the intellectual arena at that time was really very interesting of what was going on. It was a fascinating introduction, and that is at the core of what I think a good system is. You broaden the base as far as possible, and then you can lower the rates. And the classic example of that in our context and worldwide actually is GST, because we have a very broad GST system, and it means that our rate at 15% is relatively low. I mean, you go to Europe, you'll see 25%. The UK has a 20% VAT rate. So those countries that are often talked about that have zero rate bans, zero rate foods, etc., there is a trade-off with that other goods you pay higher VAT. So the broad-based low rate approach is fundamentally sound, and I don't think there's any tax advisor anywhere in New Zealand who would disagree with that. Now, how we broaden the base is where the fighting begins. And
Yeah, because
that's
this is
where
one
we
of the
come to the reports.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
sorry,
So this
after
is one
you.
of the fascinating things here is that this idea of broad-based low rate, you're right, is accepted by everyone, and we almost got there. We brought in the income tax system, which was broad-based and low rate with few exceptions. That's there and pretty much still intact. We brought in the GST system, which is broad base and low rate, pretty much intact. And then the last brick in the wall was going to be a capital gains tax, which we saw David Cagle, the then finance minister in 1989, propose before Labor was swept from office in 1990. Just imagine if we'd managed to get in a capital gains tax, which was perhaps broad-based or low rate, or at least integrated into the income tax
Just
system.
wash your mouth out, Bernard.
It would have solved that problem. But the problem is now we've got such effective PAYE income tax and such effective GST income tax that we've managed to get by without taxing capital simply because the others are so effective. And I wonder, Terry, whether now we've had this system embedded for so long that it's going to be almost impossible to change.
Well, the Treasury has reports with the long-term fiscal outlook. You will have seen us an insights briefing in there. And the language, they speak in coded language, which is when you know your alarm bells should be going off. And they talk about a fiscal adjustment that is coming. We have, as you say, managed to get by, but we've done that in two ways. One is by holding down benefits. That there has been a transfer at the law. Someone just told me today that the accommodation supplement maximum amount you can save before a person can save before you lose it is $8,100, and that was last changed in 1988. We know the thresholds for income tax were last adjusted in October 2010. And very cynically, both parties just quietly let those thresholds rise and not be adjusted for inflation, so that they could, on one hand, campaign on a promise of tax cuts, which were nothing more than inflation adjustments. And so what that means
So they're just relying on fiscal drag, Terry. I mean,
they've just relied on fiscal drag.
Yeah,
Yes.
you were talking about 30 years ago, because 35 years ago, 37 even, I recall being a baby working in Parliament, practically in my nappies, covering Roger Douglas coming out with GST, and Rob Campbell, who at that point was the economist for the Federation of Labour, totally endorsing this idea of a GST that was on everything, that any exemption from GST was regarded as a subsidy by Rob. And so that, we did this, but as you say, you also then need a concomitant indexation of the benefits, don't you?
Correct.
Or a
And you need
system
to-
under which they escalate.
Yes, that's right. And we haven't done that. And Bill English was incredibly cynical about what happened there. The Working for Families, which, if you may recall, was, what was it? Sir John Key called it socialism? Or
Communism by stealth.
Communism by stealth. Well, that was kept. But what they did do was not adjust the thresholds at which it applied. So that means that people on fairly low minimum, now the threshold was only 42,700, above which 27% basically of your working for families is abated, called back. So that's an effective, on top of your effective tax rate. So cynical things like that have been done for the last 15 years or so. And now the crunch is coming. What's really to me, what's really started to put the hammer down on the squeeze, turn the vice up, is the impact of Cyclone Gabrielle and the weather events. We now know our infrastructure just simply isn't up to scratch, and so we have to start spending on that and building it.
Do we need? How do we get some sort of national consensus on this Terry, in an MMP era? You know, you had when the Longy government did this with Roger Douglas. Roger Douglas was coming out of a period of crisis and used that, you know, did not waste the good crisis. So some of this has been entrenched, but you'd need some kind of. I mean, I remember when Paul Keating. It was just to show how old I am. Paul Keating and
The Lizard of Oz.
Bob Hawke. Well, Bob Hawke
yeah.
had a national conference with the trade unions and business in Canberra, in order to try and establish some kind of consensus on this. And I just can't see that happening in New Zealand when you've got MMP, can you?
Well, MMP gets the blame on this, but I think that's a politician. In my view, I happened to arrive just as MMP was being voted on, and I think I probably did my career no good at all when a partner was railing on about it, and I just simply said in front of whole people at dinner, well, it hasn't done Germany any harm.
Yeah.
So MMP gets the blame. I personally think politicians have sulked for 30 years about it. And I think the media have just sort of treated MMP as first past the post with variation, rather than looking at what does it really mean for our politics and how the trading has happened. I think everyone was terrified of, rather than look at Germany, they probably were looking at Israel and its sort of minor parties. But Israel, every country is different. Yeah,
The real problem was we were looking at Winston Peters with 2 mobile phones. That was the thing that really got us going.
Well, Winston got there. But politics is always trading, horse trading. I mean, what group within the Labour Party were able to push Roger Douglas's faction through? And the National Party, we hear stories about a Taliban or something in there. There's a liberal wings in it. These are all there. If anything, in my view, we haven't gone far enough with MMP, and we should be down to a 2% threshold, and that flushes these people out into the open, and we see what's on there. And
How interesting.
Just for something, I'd love to see in the debates we're going to see coming up. I'd like all the parties to be in one debate on television, not the 2 main parties and the minor parties, because they all have to work together. And let's see that happening. And I think it's going to be different this time, because at either end of the extremes, you could say the ACT or the Green Party or Te Pātu Māori are going to have a significant influence. And we should see all those 5 parties on stage and see how they interact with each other, and how the leaders, our prospective prime ministers, which of the Chris's looks to be able to handle it live. That was the premise of Borgen, by the way. But anyway.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I've always wondered why there isn't a New Zealand Borgen. I mean, if Denmark can do, you know, fantastic detective shows about people going into darkened car parks and coming up with their heads chopped off, or Borgen, you know, imagine, the beehive would call it.
Well, yeah, we could, but intellectually, I think, economically for us, our future does lie in our cultural exports. In there, we still seem to be still stuck in the 30-year-old paradigm of just let's export more of something. But if you look, what makes New Zealand unique? It is Te Ao Māori and the Pacifica. We are Auckland is the largest Polynesian city in the world. It is one of the most diverse cities in the world. We have a tremendous amount of intellectual, cultural heritage here across it, which we just tap into, but we don't want to, or because we sort of try to be a pale English. Actually,
imagine how dull the country would be without that.
But we are so much richer. That's just one of the transformation. I mean, I think about, in a way, we're handicapped because we're English speakers. If we didn't speak English, we'd be looking more like a Denmark or Scandinavia of the South. And I think we should be looking to those
How
size countries.
interesting.
Or maybe
Yeah.
look at where I come from. I was born in Northern Ireland. We look at Ireland as an example, where there is a small nation, 5 million, but it's a strong cultural heritage and able to make its own way. We tend to think about Ireland, and we think about, its low tax rate and being offshoring for multinationals. But I think we should be looking at its cultural heritage and how we could exploit that. Now, that's
Very
also
interesting. I
not
think we need
tax.
more
I've
of-
wandered way off point there, and I'm flapping my hands around.
No. I think we need to have Brett and Jermaine from the Flight of the Conchords becoming, a major contributor to GDP. And
Well, look
Taika
at
Waititi.
Taika Waititi. There's plenty more of those stories out there. I'm positive about it because Te Ao Māori is
So
a
we
fantastic-
have tax advisor, political commentator, and cultural commentator Terry Boucher. You're a
here-
man of many parts.
We're
Well,
all
just let me
Renaissance
tell-
men and women here.
We are indeed, but I got into writing. Here's a wee story for you. I met my wife 25 years ago this year at a writing course, and that started because I was writing film reviews for Ernst & Young's weekly magazine. So that's how it all began.
good. Just finally, Terry,
Sorry.
with your tax theorist hat on, I'm curious,
Yep.
broad-based low rate. If we were going to tax wealth in some form, what would be the best form of broad-based low rate?
Well, I'd start probably. What can we? The wealth tax is the issue. There is always about measurement and valuation. So that's why Associate Professor Susan St. John and I have looked at this question of what we call a fair economic return, which is looking at property values. We've said, right, let's take property values, residential property, exempt the first million net, and then apply a percentage to that. Now, we have over, $1.6 trillion of residential property in the country. So that's your starting point there is a broad base. Now, you might need to marry it alongside that, think maybe an estate tax, because one of the weaknesses we don't talk about in our system in New Zealand is everyone knows we don't have a capital gains tax, but not every jurisdiction does. We are very unique and we don't have a wealth tax or an estate tax. And that means so capital accretion happens, which is largely untaxed. So that's how I'd start the base there. And then you could look on that. As I said, there's $1.6 trillion asset, which is relatively untaxed.
And
We
the
have
sort of
QV valuing it every year. So you've got a regular process which is reliable. There'll be niggles around the margin. And I'm going to throw out something else since I was talking about it earlier. Everyone probably overrunning my time, but stay here. I don't see why. We have a progressive tax system which says basically the more you earn, more income, the higher the tax rate is because you can afford to do it. I don't see why we shouldn't be thinking about that in terms of local body rates. That if your property is worth above the median, say 20% above the median, your rates are higher. Because at the moment, the percentages we apply doesn't matter whether your house is worth 500,000 or 5 million. Maybe we should be thinking about that. And there you are, Wayne Brown. There's a suggestion for filling your gap.
Yeah, no, that would go down well as a land banker that he is. Terry, lovely to see you. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Kia ora.
Really appreciate it, and we'll have you back again. And no doubt, I will probably see you in the lockup in
Yes,
this coming
yes,
week
indeed.
in the budget. It will be
We
great.
never got to what I think might happen either.
Oh yeah, well we'll save it up for the budget itself. Lovely to see you. Thank you, Peter.
Kia ora.
You have a skateboarding dog.
Well, I have a skateboarding dog, which is actually also a very good Spanish story. So where I am is very close to the Cape of Trafalgar, or as they call it here, Trafalgar, which again is an Arabic name, of course, where Nelson destroyed the Spanish and French navies. It was led, the Spanish Armada was led at that time by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, which is more or less the area that I'm in at the moment. But there's a wonderful Spanish story, and I don't mean to be mean about Spanish people, but a ship called a naval ship called the Maldaspina, which means having a bad feeling in English, ran aground off Ibiza, the DJ capital of the world, while on a mapping operation to improve the safety of navigation in the Mediterranean. So there we go. That's this week's It's great
A
being
very
involved.
bad feeling in Spanish, indeed. Ahoy, Captain. Thank you very much, Peter. Lovely to see you. And next week you'll be back. Is that right?
In London. I'll be back in
London.
London next week.
Ah,
Yeah, having listened to Diana, I'm thinking about becoming a tax exile.
Yeah. Well, London's a great place. You can join the Russians and then all their
Well,
money.
I was thinking maybe I could join that boat, the World, and just sail around perpetually, just slightly offshore,
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
with a whole
you
bunch
could-
of other senior boomers.
No, that would be quite a place for the likes of our youngest to go on there and look after all the boomers, perhaps.
Exactly. Yes. Sir.
Yeah.
All right, Bert.
See you later.
thank you,
We shall
everybody.
see you all next week. Thank you very much. You've been with the Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey with co-host Peter Bale. See you all next week. Ka kite anō.